What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of AKP Sports Talk. As always, I'm Ari here with Korea. How are you doing on this fine Thursday night, Korea?
Well, my Mariners, but Warriors won comfortably yesterday. We talked about that, so I'm doing good. Uh, yeah, I can't complain. How you doing?
Yeah, same here. Pretty good. So we'll get right back into this game tonight in the Eastern Conference Finals. We talked about it last night. If Boston could tie up the series 1-1, and boy, did they ever come out and dominate. The Heat scored, I believe, 18 points in the first 4 or 5 minutes, and then after that, the rest of the game, it was all Boston. They take it 127 to 102. They scored 70 points in the first half, so much for the Heat defense. But credit to Boston because they hit a lot of tough shots. In about a quarter and a few minutes, they tied the 3-point shots they made in game one, and just in the quarter and a few minutes in game two. Tatum had 27, Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart had 24, Grant Williams had 19. They went 20 of 40 as a team from three. So it's tough to beat a team that hits 23s. Jimmy Butler did his thing, 29 points, but that was about it for Miami. Adebayo had 6. Vincent Oladipo had 14. So we're all tied up heading back to Boston for game 3. Korea, what was your takeaway from this game? And I guess Boston is coming back after losing game 1 where, they were down Smart and Horford, so we expected them to lose game 1, but obviously getting Smart and Horford back and their defensive presence was huge. But, this game was all about Boston's offense at the end of the day.
Yeah, everyone always raves about how Boston has pretty much one of the best defenses in the NBA. In fact, I would say the best defense in the NBA. Obviously, the stats say they're the best defensive team, but they're definitely going to have to rely on their offense against Miami, who also has a pretty good defense as well. And that's what happened today. You mentioned it, 23s for this Boston Celtics team. We saw, Marcus Smart have a day today. Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Grant Williams, all of them scored, high points for their team. Pritchard off the bench had some pretty good play. So it just comes to show you this team definitely needs to rely on their shooting more if they really want to win these games against Miami, especially with Miami, who is now kind of more trending in the more offensive direction with how many points Butler's been averaging in these playoffs right now, and just kind of how Jimmy Butler is low key right now, like the postseason MVP. If I had to put one right now, I definitely say Jimmy Butler for this Miami Heat team. He's taken this lead. He's taken his team under his wing. He did drop 29, as you mentioned, but when you have nobody else showing up, you can't really do it by yourself against a team that hits 50% of their threes, 20 of them. So, and then shooting 51% from the field compared to barely even making 30% from three for the Heat tonight. So, and it just comes to show Max Strus not as great night today, only 2 for 7. And surprisingly, only Duncan Robinson, 14 minutes. Obviously, this game was pretty out of reach, so they looked like they wanted to rest Duncan Robinson. But you would think, maybe a three-point shooter like him could come back. He didn't even hit a single three today. So just a rough day shooting-wise for this Miami Heat team. But definitely be interesting now as they go to Boston for Game 3, which is on Saturday. It'll definitely be a bigger atmosphere in Boston. They're going to bring it especially now because the last time we saw these two teams actually play with fans was 2012 when LeBron was still was with the Heat, in the Eastern Conference Finals, and we all remember that Eastern Conference Finals matchup. So Boston, they'll be giving it to Miami in Game 3 in Boston. So definitely going to see how now the Heat. We already talked about this yesterday, how the Celtics bounced back, and they did. You mentioned those two key missing pieces and Al Horford and Marcus Smart now rejoining the team, and definitely Marcus Smart, one of the bigger contributors tonight. So you mentioned one game Marcus Smart on the bench chirping, kind of getting his team back with momentum, and then that carried over in today. So yeah, Marcus Smart definitely one of the bigger reasons as to why they won this game. And Game 3 is going to be really interesting. Boston is already a 6-point favorite, meaning that, just momentum, which is going, I know, that's what I said. Looking at the line right now, Boston's already a 6-point favorite. So it just shows you that momentum that Boston had in this Game 2, now moving on to Game 3, could definitely be huge for them now that they could potentially make this series over with a 3-1 lead if they win, back-to-back home games, especially since they're playing at home against this Miami Heat team. So, but for Miami, obviously they just need to shoot the ball better as a team. Tyler Hero didn't show up that much. Duncan Robinson, Max Strus, Gabe Vincent, all those guys that they usually rely on, other than Jimmy Butler, they need to step up as well. So that'll make for an interesting game 3, but for game 2, it was just all Celtics today, and pretty much didn't see any flashes from the Heat except for Jimmy Butler's 29.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Heat still have one of the best units in the league. Just one of those games where they couldn't do anything to stop Boston with how hot they were from about halfway through the first quarter on basically the rest of the game. But yeah, well, the Heat will definitely need to take 1 or 2 in Boston, like Boston did in Miami, to make this series really competitive. It'll be interesting to see how that spread changes between now and the actual tip-off. I imagine Boston would be like a 4 to 5 point favorite is what my prediction would be. But yeah, it's definitely going to be an electric atmosphere in Boston for games 3 and 4. And I believe there's a chance Kyle Lowry's going to be back for game 3, maybe game 4. I heard before the game that he was not getting ready for game 2, but he was getting closer to being able to return. So obviously having that kind of veteran presence would be huge for them. But Gabe has been really good in his absence for the Heat. So shout out to him. So we have Friday is game 2 of the Warriors Mavericks, and then game 3, like you said, on Saturday of the Heat Celtics. So on Monday we'll kind of talk about both those games and see where the series are at heading into next week. So now we'll get into some fantasy football talk, and our topic today is kind of players who could come back down to earth, guys who had big seasons last year that we could see, taking a step back this year. So the first player I'm going to talk about is Hunter Renfrow. He was the wide receiver 10 in PPR last year, and he was arguably one of the biggest values in all of fantasy last year. I believe he went late, double-digit rounds, really late, and ended up being, especially the second half of the year, kind of one of the MVPs for many rosters, kind of leading them to the playoffs. But now you have a completely different Raiders roster this year. You added Devontae Adams. You have Darren Waller, who you figure would be more healthy this year. I was looking more into his numbers from last year, and he had a 3-game stretch, if you remember, late last year, where he had 3 straight games of 100-plus yards, and that was weeks 12 to 14. And Darren Waller left that game week 12 in the first half from the injury. And so he had his 3 most targeted games in those 3 weeks, his only 300-yard games, and that was without Waller on the field. So now you have Waller coming back healthy this year. You have Devontae Adams and his presence coming in this year, who's going to obviously beat in their number 1 on paper. Renfrow had 9 touchdowns last year, which I think could take a small step back, with Adams probably being the top red zone target for Derek Carr. Obviously, chemistry means a lot, and so Renfrow and Carr have that chemistry that Adams doesn't have yet with Carr. But I mean, they're former college teammates, so you figure that they have some kind of chemistry more than most new receivers and quarterbacks have in the NFL. And then again, Waller, you assume is going to be healthier and play more games. So I still think Renfrow is going to be solid. He's still going to have his slot role. He's still going to have a safe floor in PPR, but his ceiling isn't going to be what it was last year when. Obviously Henry Ruggs, we had with him, he was out most of last season. And so with Waller, when he was out, they had Zay Jones and, not much else at wide receiver. So Renfrow was that guy, in the middle of the field, even on the outside sometimes for Derek Carr. So I think with Devontae Adams coming in, Waller being more healthy, I still like Renfrow. I still think he's going to be solid, have a safe form PPR. He'll still have his slot role. But he's kind of one player that came to mind, kind of looking at the numbers in terms of players who could come back down to earth this year in comparison to last season. What do you think of Renfrow, Korea?
Yeah, actually, I was going to say one quick thing. I just saw this on Bleacher Report. this is about the Miami Heat now. PJ Tucker, we forgot to mention, he got injured in this game, and now he's going to be undergoing an MRI for that left knee.
Yeah.
So he could potentially be out for game 3 as well. So that could definitely be a huge loss for that Miami Heat defense right there. But going back into Hunter Renfrow, yeah, you definitely mentioned that now Devontae Adams, they have that number one receiver. Derek Carr already has that chemistry because they went to college together. And you mentioned all the other receivers that the Raiders had. Obviously when Henry Ruggs was on the team before his 150-mile-an-hour drive that almost pretty much killed someone. And then you had your Zay Jones, and then obviously Brian Edwards, but now he's been shipped off as well. Obviously, one of the latest trades to Atlanta. So you mentioned Hunter Renfrow only being that guy last year because they didn't have anyone else, and now they have that guy with Devontae Adams, and Hunter was kind of that filler. So I do think, obviously, yeah, he's going to be open in the field with a lot of maybe one-on-one coverage against Devontae Adams, but I don't think he's going to have the year. I agree with you. I don't think he's going to have that year that he had last year, this year. Now that the Raiders have that missing piece that they've always wanted, they have they have Adams, and you mentioned they still have Darren Waller, and that was actually one of the other names I was going to mention is going to have pretty much a decrease as well. That was my third one, Darren Waller. I might as well talk about him now. Definitely going to have a decrease this year because now Devontae Adams is in that number one wide receiver role, and Waller is kind of that wide receiver and tight end role. I mean, he was a top 3 tight end in a lot of fantasy leagues throughout fantasy football, but that was just because that Raiders offense didn't really have anyone to throw the ball to, and big third down situations where they needed a first down and they needed someone reliable. And Darren Waller was the only guy that was reliable when he was on the field. But now they have Devontae Adams, who doesn't miss anything. So I definitely see Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow. Their seasons are definitely going to be stepping back.
But obviously Waller was hurt most of last year, so he can't really step back because he was already pretty disappointing last year. But yeah, I still get what you're saying.
Yeah, obviously, he got injured last year, but when a full 17-game season for Darren Waller, well, 16, but now 17, you can definitely see he's still a top 3 tight end in fantasy football, along with Mark Andrews in that top 3 as well conversation. So you can definitely argue either way, but I definitely see, in terms of stepping back, obviously he was injured, but you would imagine in a full season when he was fully healthy and putting up regular Darren Waller numbers, you assume that he's going to take a step back. So this time it's not going to be a really step back. It's just going to be, people are thinking he's going to have a bounce back year when he comes back, but I don't think he's going to have that bounce back year kind of thingy, if you know what I get. But right. Transitioning into the other guy I want to talk about, I think Joe Mixon is definitely going to have a regress year this coming year. Excuse me. We saw the outburst of Joe Mixon last year just because of how stacked that offense really was. We could pretty much underestimated the Bengals offense. No one really took them serious, but they just started getting, more and more just better throughout the season. Joe Burrow, putting up numbers, throwing 500 plus yards some games, 300 plus to, his favorite target, Jamar and T. Higgins and Tyra Boyd. And, when Uzoma, who's there, that offense was stacked, and there was a lot of names there. But now a lot of people expect them to have a regress year just because of who they're playing. They have a pretty hard schedule in terms of when you really look at it. The end of the year for them, and that's fantasy championship time. They got to play the Buccaneers, who have the number one rush defense. They got to play the Patriots, who always have a good rush defense. Then they got to play the Bills, and that's a hard stretch for that. And when you really think about it in that playoff scenario, and you need that running back one, and you think Joe Mixon against the Bucs, the Patriots, and the Bills, I would not trust that, definitely, and especially in cold weather situations. Yes, they play in Cincy, but still. And then you see the rest of this. They play the Chiefs. That's probably going to be more. We've seen how the Chiefs and the Bengals play. That's just going to be throwing the ball to pretty much every receiver on the field. Going to be 500 passing yards for both quarterbacks in that game. But I don't think I just don't think personally. I don't think Joe Mixon's going to have that leap that he did last year, because a lot of people didn't really expect him to have that huge leap into the RB1 conversation last year. But I think he's going to regress down to RB2 status. I think if somehow the offense has to run for them, maybe because an injury in that wide receiver core sometime this season that happens. You never really know, obviously, but in terms of my expectations, because of this harder schedule and that offense, I think we'll take a step back. I don't think it's going to be as prolific as it was last year because now everyone's seen Jamar Chase, so everyone knows what he's about and how fast he really is. And then obviously T. Higgins is still there, but they have Tyler Boyd still. But in a crowded offense like that, and Joe Burrow, he has a little more protection now, yes, but at the same time, like it's not the best protection. They got Leo Collins, but he could be suspended anytime that any drug test he gets. So, but yeah, I definitely see Joe Mixon having a regress year just because of how that offense pretty much runs through the wide receiver core, and I think either it could open up the run game a lot more, or it's gonna really hinder Joe Mixon's pretty much not factor, but pretty much role in that Bengals offense.
Yeah, definitely interesting points, especially with the playoff schedule. I still like Mixon, especially with the 3 upgrades they have on the offensive line. Big upgrades on the offensive line, and we know how dynamic the receiving core is with Chase, Higgins, and Boyd, and I think it's only going to continue to open up the run game for Mixon. But given the playoff schedule, maybe he's a player that you kind of ride for the first half of the season and look to move right before the trade deadline, towards the second half of the season before that, tough playoff schedule. He was, I think, RB4 last year in PPR, and so that's always tough to kind of repeat as another top 5 finish. But I still like Mixon kind of in that range. But again, with that tough playoff schedule against what's the Bucks, Patriots, and Bills, I think you said.
Yeah, weeks 15, 16, and 17 are Bucks on the road, Patriots on the road, and then Bills at home.
Yeah, so I still like Mixon overall this year, but with a tough playoff schedule, maybe he's a player you consider trading kind of halfway through the year. But yeah, so the next player I'm going to talk about is Cordero Patterson. He was the RB9 overall in PPR last year, but if you look at weeks 10 on, he is the RB26. He averaged 6 targets per game the first 9 weeks versus 3 targets from weeks 10 on in that span. They added Tyler Algier out of, I think, BYU, I believe, in the draft. And there's been more talks of Patterson being moved more to wide receiver and Algier kind of leading that backfield on the early downs, which makes sense considering they have, Drake London's basically their number 1 on paper, and you got Brian Edwards, he mentioned before, and Zacchaeus as their top wide receivers. So it makes sense for the Falcons to kind of play Patterson more wide receiver and then have Algier lead the backfield. But with that, I don't think Patterson is going to repeat or come even close to what he did last year, especially at his age. I think it was really an outlier year from a fantasy standpoint. Again, obviously, this is all fantasy football, not take away from his talent and what he can do on the field, obviously. But just purely from a fantasy perspective, I don't see him coming even close to the top 10 finish that he had last year. It'll be interesting to see where he goes in drafts this year, kind of if people look at the end of the season finish to the top 10, or if people remember him kind of fading away late last year and kind of take that into consideration. But yeah, what's your take on Patterson, Korea?
I completely agree with you. That offense is pretty much changing. We've seen, now Marcus Mariota being that one, maybe that transition year quarterback. They brought in Drake London in the draft. They brought in Brian Edwards in a trade. They still have Kyle Pitts in that offense. Obviously, the Calvin Ridley situation is, pending since he's suspended right now. But still, then you get to Cordell Patterson's, and then you mentioned Algier out of BYU is probably going to be that 3-down back that they're hoping that he can be. So I definitely see Cordell Patterson's fantasy football stock decreasing next year, just because of how crowded that offense is going to be when you really think about it. Kyle Pitts, obviously, Falcons took him 4th in that 2021 draft for a reason, because he's definitely going to be that guy on the offense. They took him 4th, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
That's what I thought. Yeah, I want to double check. And then, then they took Drake London in this draft. They're reforming their whole offense right now. Now that Julio's gone, and obviously Calvin Ridley is suspended, and they shipped off Matt Ryan. They bring in Marcus Mariota for that transition year. So I definitely see Cordell Patterson kind of being not like the weak link, but kind of the person that's going to have the worst fantasy stock because of this. You mentioned his numbers last year. The new reason was because he was that offense. I mean, he played running back. He was the receiver when Ridley was sidelined because of his personal reasons. He was that, and then Kyle Pitts, obviously a little underwhelming throughout his year, but I definitely see Cordell Patterson's stock decreasing next year. I believe it will be just because of how crowded that offense is really going to get in terms of talent. I mean, Bryan Edwards, yes, he's definitely going to be probably that wide receiver 2 on that team for this upcoming season behind Drake London, but you never know. I mean, plus Marcus Mariota, we've seen him have legs still, so Marcus Mariota can definitely scramble in case of emergencies or stuff like that. So.
And for me, it's less about the offense being crowded and more just that Patterson's not going to see the carries that he saw last year, which is part of a huge reason for success. Like we saw with Debo, both being used to the running back and wide receiver. I think with Patterson being more used solely as a receiver, and like you mentioned with Mariota and the uncertainty of that passing offense overall. I mean, you can argue that they're going to be playing from behind a lot, so that kind of favors the receivers in that regard from a fantasy perspective, but. It just comes down to Patterson's role and not being the same as it was last year with the addition of Algier.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. And then my last one, I'm going with Chase Claypool. Obviously, Pittsburgh, they're in a transition year as well. Ben Roethlisberger's out, Juju's out, and now they bring in George Pickens in the draft. They drafted Kenny Pickett. They signed Mitchell Trubisky in the offseason. And, Chase Claypool, who's kind of obviously him and Deontay Johnson are kind of like the two kind of now not like veteran wide receivers, but kind of the guys who are now kind of supposed to be taking the lead. And I think Chase Claypool's going to have a down year this year. I mean, yes, the passing has not been great with Ben Roethlisberger in the past couple seasons. We've seen that he's not that quarterback that he can throw 300 plus yards in about an average game every year anymore. But now you have a rookie quarterback in Kenny Pickett who people are saying, well, maybe the Steelers took him too high, but at the same time, he's the hometown kid. He went to Pitt. In fact, they play in the same damn sports complex, so he doesn't have to go that far to play for the Pittsburgh Steelers. But then at the same time, you have Mitchell Trubisky, and everyone's been questioning him because was it him or was it the offense that Nagy was running? So you have two questionable quarterbacks, and then you have Juju leave, and then you draft George Pickens, who's everyone is very hyped about, especially in that Steelers locker room, just because of how his attitude is. But obviously, we've seen him at Georgia, and he is that dude. He's definitely one of the best wide receivers in this draft class, as we've talked about getting ready for the NFL draft. And I think Chase Claypool is going to have a bad effect on it. I mean, Chase Claypool, we've seen a lot of memes about him as well, obviously with the TikToks and thinking it was a first down against the Minnesota Vikings, and turns out it wasn't, and all that stuff. But not to attack his character or anything, but in terms of a player, I just don't think that he's going to be seeing the receptions or the targets that he wants to be seeing or should be seeing when you have Deontay Johnson, who I think is going to be, kind of in that wide receiver too, but could ascend to the number one role if he gets his hands together, because that man drops everything. And then you have George Pickens coming in, who definitely has the size that favors him just because of how tall he is and how lengthy he is. So, I definitely see Chase Claypool taking a step back this year just because of, the team around him and, the changing offense that is. And plus, they still have Najee in that backfield, who is definitely a pounding ground running back and definitely fights for those extra yards. And I think they're going to be relying on him a lot more this coming season just because of how powerful he was last year and how that offensive line should be getting better this year so that he can be that, pounding ground running back that they expect him to be.
Yeah, I mean, Claypool was like barely a top 40 receiver last year, so I guess maybe it's coming back down to earth compared to like pre-NFL drafts, maybe expectations, what this is more of. But yeah, I mean, Claypool is one of those players for me that I just tend to avoid in fantasy. Those guys who are, not so much deep threat, but just going to be reliant on big plays. I think it was it a couple years ago when Claypool had that like 3 touchdown game? I want to say it was a couple years ago, but he's going to have his big plays, his big moments, and I do think that the Steelers' passing offense will be better this year. With whether it's Trubisky or Pickett, it's going to be better than what it was last year with Roethlisberger. They're going to throw downfield more, and in a way that will benefit a guy like Claypool. But like you said, it's a crowded receiving core. and crowded offense overall. You got Firemouth as well, who's going to have a role in the passing game. And then obviously Harris will have his workhorse role, and then Deontay and Pickens. So definitely a crowded offense. And, Claypool's still going to have his kind of role on the outside. But it's just players, kind of like him that I just tend to avoid personally. Just guys who are going to be super reliant on big plays. And obviously that's kind of subjective to an extent with the players. Some players are just that's kind of their role in their offense. And I think, Claypool is great for Pittsburgh from a real life standpoint, kind of taking the top off of defenses, with his ability downfield. But yeah, it's players like him that I tend to avoid just due to their consistency concerns, on a week to week basis and all of that. So that was really the 4 players that we had. Was there anything else you had in mind, Korea?
Well, obviously I mentioned Darren Waller for a little bit, but other than that, no. You pretty much talked about yours. I talked about mine. I'm okay with mine, but definitely in terms of just, I'm not saying come back down to earth. I'm just talking definitely having a regress in terms of targets and all that stuff and running and yards. So I definitely see those 2, but there's plenty of other names around the league. We'll get into those later. Next week, I think we're going to be hoping to get a mock draft going on Sleeper. So be on the lookout for that. We will be sending out the codes, and we will actually be doing the live run. We tried it here first, and it worked out for us. It was a little bit of a challenge at first, but we got it in the end. So next week, look out for that. We'll be letting you know what day we're going to be doing our first mock draft. So, and it will be just a regular mock. I'm pretty sure. Just 12 teams, kind of planning out the field because it's still early. We're not even in June yet, but, OTAs are coming through, and then rookie camp already just happened, and then we're going to be getting up to training camp relatively soon here, and then bam, it's already the preseason. So it's going to be going fast, but keep on the lookout for more and more fantasy football content as we get closer and closer to the beginning of the 2022 regular season.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And then, like I said before, we'll talk also on the NBA picture come Monday. We'll be through game 2 of the Western Conference, or game 3 maybe if that's on Sunday, and then game 3 of both series. So we'll see where those series are at and where they're headed, and then fantasy football as well. Hopefully mock draft Monday. So I think Monday we'll probably try to do that, but maybe Monday or Wednesday. But I'll let you guys know on my fantasy account, fantasy.footballexpert on Instagram. And like Korea said, we'll send out the code either on my Instagram story or in the Discord or somewhere. One of those places we'll send out the code maybe like a half hour before we start. And so now we'll get to do an actual mock draft. It's not against computers and against real people that are making these decisions. That'll do it for this episode. Thank you guys all for watching and tuning in. We hope you all have a good weekend, and we will catch you all on Monday.